Hi, my name is Tomás Olivier, and I'm going to be presenting a manuscript in which I am collaborating with Natalia Díaz Tadeo and Micaela Trimble from Uruguay, which we have titled this manuscript for now Engagement and Participation in a Collaborative Forum, an Analysis of Stakeholder Involvement in the Santa Lucia River Basin in Uruguay. The usual caveats apply here. This is a work in progress. We're in the early stages of this, so any feedback, comments, or suggestions you may have will be extremely welcome. So, to give you a little bit of context for this manuscript, we're approaching this study from the perspective of collaborative governance. In particular, we're interested in getting a better understanding of how collaborative processes or initiatives evolve over time. Over the last couple of years, there have been several studies that have shed light on the evolution of collaborative initiatives over time. Some people arguing that these initiatives go through a life cycle with very identifiable stages. However, most of these studies have focused on cases in the global north. So, what we're interested in learning more about here is how do collaborative initiatives evolve, but in other countries, more specifically in countries in Latin America that have a series of characteristics, um, and for which we know that the institutional environments tend to shape incentives and behavior strategies. Also, we know from the literature studying policy forums in these countries that these policy forums tend to be more ephemeral than their counterparts in, say, the US. And also that actors tend to participate in policy forums where other participants also already share similar perceptions to that. So in this manuscript, we're building on some propositions developed by Heikkila and Gerlach, who argue that we can understand or we can approach this study of the evolution of collaboratives by looking at certain dynamics that take place within these spaces. And in doing so, the authors develop a series of propositions. Here we're interested in focusing on two of them. One argues that the investments that these initiatives make on the governance and administration are likely to be more intensive at the initial setup of the space and then tend to diminish over time as members start focusing on other issues. Also, that the investments in internal communication, and specifically here we're focusing on active engagement of the actors and participants in a collaborative space, are likely to wane over time during a collaborative process. And we added an additional proposition here for which that has to do more specifically with our case, that focuses on the role of focusing events. The case that I'm gonna be talking about in a second went through a focusing event, a crisis, and so we argue that when these events happen, they will tend to alter the trend of dynamics or dynamics of a collaborative space. So what we're doing here is we're analyzing a case in Uruguay, which is the Santa Lucia River Basin. This is the third largest basin in the country, but also the one that provides drinking water to 60% of the entire population of the country. The Basin Committee was created in 2013, and it was granted basically an advisory role to the government. So this PACE brings together actors from the region, stakeholders, key stakeholders, but the Basin Committee itself doesn't have any authority to implement or decide on specific rules. It's just an advisory role. So what we're doing here is we collected 10 years of meeting minutes from this Basin Committee, ranging starting from 2013 until 2023. We identified 19 documents. We hand coded all 19 of those documents, identifying 56 unique organizations and 31 different topics that were discussed by actors in these meeting minutes during that 10-year period. With that information, what we did is we, on one hand, conducted a text analysis capturing the average sentiment expressed by a meeting participant with regards to a topic, and this could be positive or negative. And then we conducted a network analysis where for every meeting minute, we identified the actors and topics they discussed and created networks. Particularly, we created networks capturing connections between actors, basically where a linkage between two actors indicate that those two actors discussed the same topic in a given meeting. So let me show you quickly some of the findings that we have so far. Or one of the first proposition we were interested in looking at argued that investment in governance and administration are likely to be most intensive at the beginning and then wane over time. In this plot, what we have is the percentage of just the four most important topics that were discussed over time in these meetings. The green line here showcases what we coded operational aspects that are closest to these governance and administration topics. And the pink line here is an action plan discussed by the committee. This other darker purplish line is a basin plan. And lastly, this blue line indicates an infrastructure proposal that was presented by the government, by the national administration at the time during a period of extreme drought that affected the country during this time period. And what we see here is that if the proposition were to hold, the green line should tend to decline over time. Instead, we see that it sort of stays around the same level of preponderance over time with a small decline in the middle. But we don't see these actors stop discussing these operational aspects over time, even as new problems emerge or important topics are being discussed. The other two propositions that we were interested focused on investments in internal communication. In here, we're looking at particularly active engagement, and we're looking at the influence of focusing events in these dynamics. So here, this first plot, what we have is the number of unique organizations that were identified in a given meeting minute, and then we see the evolution over time. And we see that early on, there were a considerable number of organizations, but the level of participation tended to decline for a while until it stabilized towards the end. This line right here demarks when the Basin Committee started discussing this Neptuno project, which was a major infrastructure project, highly politicized, highly conflicted, developed to address the consequences of a drought that impacted the country back then. And then the other thing we did is we captured the density of these networks over time, the networks that we created for every meeting minute. Here, what network density would capture is the extent to which actors are discussing the same topics in a given minute. A highly dense network would have lots of linkages. And remember, a linkage here between two actors captures that two actors are discussing the same topic. If we have a network with zero density, means that no one is talking about the same topic. And we do see how over time this density seemed to increase, particularly during these discussions regarding this infrastructure project, Proyecto Neptuno. So what is this all telling us about collaborative spaces in a country like Uruguay? Well, what we are inferring so far, what we're seeing so far is that when scope and mandates are limited, discussion and operational aspects seems to prolong over time. And we see this in the meeting minutes. People are constantly discussing, well, is this something we can discuss as a Basin Committee? What are the extent of the authorities that we have to do something about these issues? And this is something over which there seems to be considerable consistent discussions and somewhat conflict over time. And finally, what we do find is that highly salient topics like this infrastructure project may allow overcoming these design constraints through which we see that these issues are being discussed more than operational aspects, and we see that actors seem to engage a lot more with one another. So this might be seen something that allows to overcome the limitations of the Basin Committee. And I have this here in italics because this comes from the qualitative evidence that we have collected so far, is that yes, we do see more discussion around the same topics during that time, but in practice and the qualitative evidence, what it's telling us is that in fact, what it led is to even more centralization. The national government was just using the venue, the space, to just share information, but it didn't lead too much to a discussion that led to changes or influence in this policy. So as part of our next steps, what we want to do is more formally combine this quantitative analysis about the evolution of the collaborative space with qualitative evidence from the perceptions of many participants. And we also want to do an additional categorization of the topics that are being discussed by these actors to try to capture whether someone is discussing a topic in support, in opposition, or in kind of a neutral manner. And we want to develop further we want to develop measurements to capture whether actors are agreeing or conflicting with each other as expressed in these meeting minutes over time. That's it. I'm looking forward to your comments, feedback, suggestions. Thank you for your time.